What's up, Gear Mortals? Trey Xavier here. Today I'm here to talk to you about something that I get asked about all the time, and that's pedal order. The order of effects in your signal chain is a very personal thing. Nobody can tell you how to do it the right way because there's no right and there's no wrong. There's a lot of information out there on the internet, and a lot of it makes it seem like it's very, very cut and dry and absolute, and that is absolutely not the case. There isn't a right and wrong way, but I see a ton of people unhappy with the sound that they're getting because they don't have the signal chain set up in a way that is good for them. It's not going to get the sound that they're looking for. It's not bad or good, it's just not what they want. And part of that is because they have it in the wrong order for that sound. So that's something that we're going to address today. I've seen people drop a bunch of money on a new effect because they saw somebody else use it in their signal chain and they think it's going to be the magic bullet, and then they're disappointed because they don't put it in the right place in the chain to get the sound that they're looking for. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully by the end of it you'll understand the best place to put your pedals for the sound that you're going for. So in order to expedite this lesson today, I'm going to use something called bias effects from Positive Grid. And what that is it's both a plugin for your DAW and a standalone app for your computer. And it's essentially a digital pedal board. And that's going to make it so easy for me to swap pedals out, stick them in different places in the order, and basically just give you the simplest and quickest route to getting these tones that you're looking for. Now, naturally, it's not going to be exactly identically the same as plugging into an amp, but to save myself a whole crap ton of work and time, and also being able to have access to a bunch of different kinds of pedals that I don't have here in my arsenal, it's going to make everything a great deal easier, and you're going to get a chance to see how the app works. So let's get to it. So my philosophy here is not to give you a fish. If you came in here thinking that I was just going to give you an easy set of rules to follow to put your pedal board together, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. This is the teach a man to fish philosophy lesson. I want you to understand what's going on so that you can make your own informed decisions about where to put different things in your signal chain, okay? So it's going to be a little more in depth than just a typical list. If you want a list, there's literally 100 places online that you can find one, and you'll be happy to know that they're all different. So good luck with that. So really easy right off the bat, I always put the tuner first. The reason for this is that tuner is probably a digital device in this day and age that can be easily confused if there's a bunch of crazy harmonics on there, as might be generated by a distortion pedal or a boost or an overdrive or anything like that, or some kind of crazy flanger changing the sound. You don't want to confuse your tuner, especially not on stage. If you can't hear yourself while you're tuning and you're dependent on that needle and the little letter, it's got to be real accurate. The other reason is that typically a tuner can function as a mute. So if you have it set up the right way, you step on it and the signal is cut. So you can do that in between songs. You don't have to worry about noise while your singer's trying to get the crowd riled up. I can't hear you! And that kind of shit. Yeah, so for all those reasons, tuner comes first. So one very common problem that I see is people putting the delay and reverb, what I like to call time and space effects, because they're time-based and they give you a sense of space, in relation to whatever's providing the main distortion or drive sound for their tone. They're not putting them in relation to each other in a place where they're getting a sound that they want. And the reason for that is several different things, but the main one is just that anytime you have a reverb or delay, which essentially are kind of the same thing if you think about it, it's just a lot of hearing your sound coming back at you. In the case of delay, it's a much more of like a 1-to-1 ratio. You hear the original signal, and then you hear it happen again over here, and you hear it happen again over here. With reverb, it's a much washier kind of repeating, but it's the same basic idea. There's a repeating of the original signal that's coming in. So what ends up happening when you have that going into something that's adding distortion is that it's just too much stuff hitting it at the same time, number one. And number two, each of those repeats is going to be heard a lot more loudly than it would have otherwise, because distortion is essentially kind of an extreme compression. And so it raises the level of everything coming in and sort of squashes the dynamics. So whereas if you just hit a note and you expect to hear, right, the original note and then the second repeat and the third repeat, as you know, they get lower and lower as it goes on. But what ends up happening is all of them start to become closer to the same volume. So it's a lot less dynamic, and it's the effect is just a lot more apparent. And all of those repeats are very distorted. So I'm going to demonstrate for you right now what it sounds like when you put the delay both in front of and after your distortion pedal. So the most common way to do it, and the way that I like to do it, is to stick the delay either in your effects loop if you're using a high gain amp and the amp is the source of your distortion, or to use it after your distortion pedal if a pedal is the source of your high gain distortion sound. So you hear that the original performance comes through, and then we have a couple repeats. And the way that delay works, those repeats are kind of happening over each other to a certain extent. But it's a very clean sound comparatively, and that's the sound that I like. Now here is the alternative. You see how easy it is with bias effects here? We're just swapping out pedals like that. I don't have to go in there with some cables and crap. Really cool. Check it out. See how we can hear those repeats for a lot longer than we did the first time, and that's because everything is just louder, and they all sound really distorted, and I don't want to say ugly. There's a lot of bands that use this idea to great effect. A lot of post-rock bands, bands that use a lot of ambient sounds will sometimes stick a delay and or a reverb before, like in the front of a high gain amp. And it's a cool sound. It's not bad. I don't want you to think that I'm making some judgment here. It's a matter of whether or not you like it. So now let's try it with reverb. Same idea. So this is like a spring reverb style. Okay, so now we put it after the distortion. It's just cleaner. And there's also there's a bit less of the effect. So in bias effects here, essentially anything you put over to the right of the amp is basically like it's in the effects loop. Okay, so you're going to hear it after the amp sound. So in this case, I'm using a really clean amp sound, but if you're using a high gain amp, you can kind of treat that as if it's a distortion pedal like we just did. Your amp is basically an effect. You can think of it, it's a tone shaping thing. If you treat it like it's an effects pedal, then it'll start to make a little bit more sense. So the effects loop on the amp, on just about every amp as far as I know, puts whatever pedal you put in the effects loop, it puts it in between the preamp and the power amp. Okay, so the preamp on an amp generally is where you're getting the most distortion from. The preamp distortion is usually the grittiest. You can make a power amp distort, of course, but it's a very different sound. So generally, if you're treating the preamp section as a distortion pedal, and I think that's the best way to think of it personally. So because of this, if you want to have this effect of the reverb and delay running into distortion, then what you're going to want to do is stick that in front of any high gain amp rather than in the effects loop. And if you want that really clean, those nice clean repeats, and with no jump in volume of your ambient effects, then you're going to want to stick it in the effects loop if at all possible. So here's what it sounds like kind of in the effects loop with both reverb and delay. Honestly, it's a little bit harder to distinguish the difference between delay first and reverb first. It's a little bit of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But that's definitely something that you're going to have to hear to decide which one you like the best. I'll try delay first and see what happens here. So here's delay into reverb. Here's reverb into delay. Oh, wow. Wow, this actually kind of contradicts the thing that I just said, because with the reverb out front, there's a lot more repeats of the delay, or they're a lot more apparent. Interesting. Let's hear it with some distortion and see if that makes it a little more apparent. Here's delay first. Yeah, something about putting the reverb first gives it a much larger sound, much more ambient. It gives the reverb this kind of sustained feel, whereas, generally the decay of the reverb dies off a little bit quicker. This way, it's kind of being sent out multiple times as each delay takes that reverberated signal and repeats it over and over again. So it gives it this kind of sustained reverb sound, which is I think is a really cool sound. I like it. What do you think? Personally, I like to actually run them in parallel so that the signal is hitting both of them at the same time and then recombining. If that's at all an option, I highly recommend that you do it. It keeps the whole thing just so clean sounding, so you're not running one into the other. So that kind of covers time-based effects. Generally, they kind of go towards the end of the signal chain, either towards the end of your pedal board or in the effects loop, which puts them at the very end of the whole thing, since your board is generally going straight into the front of your amp, right into the input. I realize that means that we're kind of moving backwards now, but I wanted to cover that first because it's, I think, the most common error that people make. Now, because there is a very strong likelihood that your amplifier is the source of your distortion tone, we're going to talk about distortion next. So I'm going to go into bias here, and I'm going to pull up my favorite distortion sound, which is this Keith Merrow 5153 sound. So let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Anytime you add distortion, which is essentially the same as extreme compression, you are going to be raising the noise floor. All electronics have inherent noise, and any signal that you get is going to have a certain amount of noise just in there. And if you raise the overall volume, if you raise the gain up, all that noise comes with it, and it just gets louder and louder as you raise it up. So especially something like a compressor pedal or distortion is going to raise that up. So you have to be thinking in terms of, you want to start with the cleanest possible signal with the least amount of gain added, so that the noise floor is relatively low as you're going into the distortion that's going to raise it up. So let's say this right here is your noise floor, and this is the level of your signal. So right now, the noise floor is pretty low. You probably can't hear it at all. But as you raise the level of the signal, the noise floor comes up with it, and then you start to hear it, even as you hear more of the signal. So it's just something you got to watch out for. So because of this, we want to put the distortion as early in the chain as possible as a general rule, except that like I said, in metal especially, the amp is the source of your distortion, so there isn't necessarily a whole lot that you can do about it. So you might think that the solution to this is therefore just to stick everything in the effects loop. But because of the nature of the metal sound, there's actually things that we're going to stick in front of the distortion that are going to add a bunch of noise. And that sucks, but that's kind of just the nature of the beast. In metal, personally, I like to stick an overdrive pedal and or a boost in front of the amp to really juice up the front end, do a little bit of tone shaping beforehand, and we just want to smack the shit out of the input of the amp to get that screaming, just gnarly metal sound. So those are both boost pedals, any kind of compression, and overdrive, which, I mean, honestly, I'm kind of generally using the overdrive as a boost anyways. So whatever, anything like that is going to raise the noise floor, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that except to get the quietest possible pedals that are made really well with good quality electronics that don't pick up a lot of noise. But yeah, so moving backwards in the chain, the thing that you want to have typically right in front of the amp is going to be your overdrive and or boost. There is a notable exception to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, there is a bit of controversy as to where the gate pedal should go. Now, a gate, if you're unaware, is just what it sounds like. It's like a little drawbridge for your guitar signal coming in, and basically it raises or lowers the gate depending on the threshold control and how you set it to let the sound in or not. Now, basically anything, depending on how you set the threshold, anything below that threshold doesn't get through. The gate slams down and you hear nothing. Like I said, an overdrive or boost pedal raises the noise floor. So if you want a dead silent rig, you might want to put the gate after your boost. So because of the way that a gate pedal works, it's not always super duper lightning fast that the gate comes up. And so it can sometimes cut off some of your attack right before it hits the front of the amp. And that's not a good sound. Some people prefer to put it before their boost pedal so that as the signal comes in, it's getting boosted up right after you hit it, and then it's smacking the front of your amp all that much harder. Whereas if you have the order reversed, it's boosting your signal up, and then the gate is opening, and then it's hitting the amp. So that's something you're gonna have to try for yourself. I'm gonna demonstrate it right here, and you're gonna have to let me know what you think sounds better. So you're gonna have to listen really carefully to hear the difference here. Here's gate first. Okay, now here's boost first. Honestly, I think the difference is kind of minimal. Some people like to have a gate at the beginning of their signal chain and then one in the effects loop set to different thresholds and sensitivity so that they can have a dead silent rig all the time but still have that boost in there that's raising up the noise level. I said dead silent all the time. What I mean is just when you're not playing. For any kind of super choppy rhythm parts where you're stopping and starting a lot, you want those in between bits to be dead silent as much as possible. Part of the problem with using bias effects here is that it's really, really quiet, and normally we'd be experiencing some amp hiss and all that, and I'm not getting into that right now, so I can't super duper easily demonstrate this gate pedal the way that it's supposed to be, but you get the idea. So in terms of the boost and gate order, I really don't think it's nearly as important as where you put the time-based effects, but it's definitely something to think about. And when you're listening to your own rig and trying to decide which one's best for you, the things you want to think about and listen for are your attack and decay. If having the gate before or after the boost is having some kind of an effect on those, then you might want to try it in a different spot, because if you're not getting the attack, the nice pick attack out of what you're hitting, it could be your settings on the gate, but it might also be because it's crushing the sound in the wrong spot. Now, in metal, we don't typically use a whole lot of compression in a guitar chain, and the reason for that is that, like I said, distortion essentially is compression. A compressor pedal makes a lot more sense for a clean signal. That being said, if you are going to use a compressor, you should basically think of it in the same way as like a boost or some distortion. They're kind of in the same category. In the same way that distortion really squashes the dynamics of your signal, a compressor does the same. So what you want to think about is, are the effects that are coming after your distortion or your compression, are they things that you want to be affected by the way that you play, the dynamics of how you're picking? Do you want them to something like an auto wah, okay, like a touch sensitive wah pedal? It's going to make a big difference how hard you pick. Okay, now once again, you're probably not using these that much if you're playing metal, but if you stick that after a compressor, it's just going to be activated all the time instead of like, being able to hit it a little bit harder and get more of the effect. You might want to put those before your compression, distortion, and or boost, just so that you can really get the experience of playing with a dynamic type of a sound. Here's another one whose placement will vary greatly depending on how you want it to interact with your distortion sound, and that's a volume pedal. Now, a volume pedal is essentially like the volume knob on your guitar. If you have it in the front of your chain before any distorted sound, as you turn the volume down, the signal is going to become less distorted. So, whereas if you put it after the distortion, the volume will get lower, even though the signal will remain completely distorted all the way through the volume level. So if you stick it before it, what's going to happen as the volume goes down, the signal is going to become less and less distorted. So you have to think about which of those you want to happen. I'll demonstrate that for you right now. How cool is that? There's a volume pedal in here, and you just grab it and move it back and forth. Before the amp, which in this case is the source of our distortion. So you can hear as I lower the volume pedal, we're getting a lot less gain out of the amp. So now if I stick it on the other side of the amp and try it, as the volume goes down, the amp, you can hear it's still really super distorted. So remember, when I have it after the amp, it's in the effects loop. So essentially, one position gives you a more dynamic interaction with the distortion, and the other one is just an overall volume for your whole rig. So that's going to vary a lot depending on your playing style. If you want that kind of dynamic of being able to add more or less gain to your signal, then you're going to want to put the volume closer to the front, anywhere before your distortion, really. And then if you just want to have almost like an on-off switch, or to be able to do like kind of a fade out of your whole sound of everything coming in exactly the way it is, just being lowered or raised up, then you want to put it after everything in your effects loop, all the way at the very end of the effects loop, right before it goes back into the power amp. I think it's pretty cool to be able to have that kind of dynamic control over the signal that's going into the distortion and be able to, back it off a little bit and then hit it more full gain at different spots during a song or during a set. In theory, anyways. I mean, in practice, I don't often use a volume pedal, and if I do, it's usually basically an on-off switch for me. So, if you're playing deathcore, you probably aren't really doing like some in-between mid-gain sounds, like where you just want like a little bit of a furry edge to your, it's either it's on or it's off. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about modulation effects because in metal they're not used a whole hell of a lot. But let's say you want to be Eddie Van Halen today and you want to use like a phaser sound, the most important thing to consider is that if you stick it before a whole ton of gain, you're not really going to hear it that much. So that's something you definitely are going to want to stick in your effects loop, because modulation effects really like to have a lot of very harmonically rich content coming in the front end, and you'll actually just hear a lot more of the effect, because essentially what it's doing is it's going through and it's sort of emphasizing different parts of the frequency spectrum, and if there's no sound in a certain spot for it to emphasize, basically what you'll get is nothing. So you won't really want that nice distorted sound coming in into your modulation effect, and I'll show you. This is going to be really, really obvious. So here we go. Check it out. Here it is with a phaser in the effects loop. Here it is right before the amp. So you can definitely still hear that it's on there, but you're kind of like, what's going on there? Whereas if you put it in the effects loop, it's like mostly phaser. So you might like just having a more subtle effect, but if you want people to really know that there's a phaser on there, you're going to want to stick it into the effects loop for sure. All right, here's another one that people argue about a lot, the wah pedal. Where do we put the wah pedal? Obviously, there's a bunch of different places that you can put it, but as we have done for most of the rest of this, we're going to think about where is it going in terms of the distortion. Now, in general, if you place it before the distortion, what you wind up with is a much broader sweep. For some reason, if you have the distortion going into the wah pedal, it kind of squashes the range of the sweep, and there's a point at which the signal kind of disappears. All right, so here's what the wah sounds like before the amp. Here it is after the amp in the effects loop. Jesus. Yeah, so this reminds me of another very important reason not to put the wah in your effects loop, and that is that you get extreme volume fluctuations depending on which part of the wah you're on, and you could just straight up blow out your speakers, because you'll hit a peak frequency and it'll be incredibly loud. It gets real ugly real fast. So essentially, you're going to want to put it somewhere early in your chain. Maybe at the very beginning, maybe after the gate. Let's try it before and after the boost and see what happens. Okay, there it is after the boost. Let's try it before. I kind of like it better after the boost. Interesting. It sounds smoother to me after the boost. I think maybe because it's just a little more, it's a little hotter of a signal coming in. I don't really know, to be honest. I know that in the past I have stuck a boost in front of a wah with great effect. I'm not really sure why it works better, but that's something that I like. If you like it the other way, I'll still be your friend. Your main takeaway here should be that you have to be thinking in terms of series. So how each piece of your signal chain is going to be affecting not just the one immediately after it, but all the ones after that. Remember that compression, boost, and distortion all raise the noise floor of all the things that came before it. So you want to keep your signal as clean as possible up until then, if you can. You got to remember that compression and distortion limit your dynamic content. So if you have an effect that is heavily dependent on the dynamics of how you play, then you want to put that earlier in the chain before your compression and or distortion. You want to remember that modulation effects love getting a compressed and distorted signal because of the increased harmonic content that's going on. So you want to stick those kind of farther back after your distortion, preferably in your effects loop if you have one. You want to remember that time-based effects like delay and reverb sound cleaner if you have the distortion sound coming into them rather than the other way around. Once again, not necessarily better or worse, just sort of cleaner sounding. You want to keep in mind that a volume pedal will do drastically different things if you put it before or after a distortion effect. And essentially, it's just like rolling up or down your guitar's volume. It lowers the gain of what's going in, and therefore you'll get less of actually whatever effect is going to come after it. And if it's the last thing in your chain, then the only thing it's going to get less of is everything. So for a volume pedal, what you want to think of, anything before it is going to stay the same sound. There's just going to be less volume for it. And anything that comes after it is going to be less obvious because the signal going into it is going to be reduced. So the actual effect that you're going into is going to be a lot less affected or effective. And last but not least, you want to think about wah as being a pretty volatile thing. And if it goes into a compressor or a distortion sound, those extreme peaks, those crazy volume changes are going to be reduced. And that's something that you really want, because if you stick it in the effects loop after your distortion and right before the power amp, the changes in volume are just going to deafen you and your poor audience, and you don't want that. A very common sound in like classic rock is to run a wah into a fuzz pedal, and part of the reason is because it limits those crazy dynamic peaks. It's still a very dynamic sound, but what you're hearing is more of the sweep through the frequencies instead of these radical volume shifts. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So my personal signal chain pedal order typically goes a tuner and then a drive pedal, an overdrive pedal that I use almost only as a boost. Sometimes a very, very tiny bit of gain on there. And then I like to have the wah pedal next. And then after that, it's just going straight into the amp. In the effects loop, I like to have one or two things. If I want the effects loop to be my like solo boost and there isn't a separate volume boost in the amp, then I will stick a boost pedal in front of the delay. So the effects loop is boost and then delay. And the reason for this is if you stick a boost into the effects loop, it's coming before the power amp. And if you hit the power amp harder, it's going to get louder. So that's why we didn't put the wah in the effects loop, because those volume changes will just fuck your shit up, and I don't want that. But I might want to kick in the effects loop and get both some ambience for my solo and a volume boost. And so if you have a button that just kicks in the effects loop, you're golden. That's your whole sound right there. So that's how I do it. If I've got like a separate solo boost, like a channel specifically to do that, great. Then I don't have to worry about the boost being in there. But for stuff like my Fly Rig pedal board series that I've been working on, it's kind of based on I'm flying into a place and I'm just plugging into a strange amp, and I don't know, am I gonna have a separate solo boost volume? Better safe than sorry. So you have that boost on there. If you got to turn it on, great. If not, whatever. You can get one that's this big that sounds just as good as any other boost, and it's better to have it on there and not have to worry about it. Sometimes I also like to put a reverb in there that will also come after the delay, and that's just for more ambience for my solos. If I want it to be super fucking epic, boom, there it is. Another thing I like to stick in my effects loops sometimes is an EQ, and the reason for that is I like my lead tone to be drastically different from my rhythm tone, or at least smoothed off in the high end, and then a little bit of a boost around the 2200. I personally find makes my leads scream in a way that I like. So that also helps. So all of these things are principles that are going to help you to build the pedal board that you need to get the sounds that you're trying to achieve. The only hard and fast rule is to use your ear. And I know that's kind of a cop-out, but more specifically, to be thinking for these parameters that the guidelines that I've given you, the different parameters that you're listening for, how these things are affecting each other. So people say using your ear, but really it's using your ear in combination with your brain. So hopefully I've given you the tools to be able to use your brain a little bit more and to diagnose the things that you're hearing. And something like this, Bias Effects, is a really cool plugin that will allow you to do this without spending a fucking hour plugging and unplugging cables, spending a fortune on effects that you maybe won't need or use, and it's just damn easy. So if you're trying to really dial in a pedal board before you go out and buy 10 pedals, you might want to try something like Bias Effects. If you are a Bias Effects user, I'm going to have my personal settings up on the Tone Cloud for you to download. It's just going to be under my name, Trey Xavier. I'll have a rhythm and a lead setting for you to try out. And thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something from this lesson, and hopefully I answered some questions that you may have had. And I'm sure you're going to leave me comments whether I ask you to or not, and I'm sure many of them will be angry and disagreeing with me, and that's totally fine. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you real soon. Let's talk about locking tuners. This is something that I see a lot of people using wrong and then complaining that they're not getting the results that they're looking for. So I'm going to show you how to use locking tuners correctly so that you can get the maximum tuning stability out of your instrument. So the concept behind the locking tuner is very simple. A little clamp inside the tuning post actually grabs your string and keeps it from coming loose, and you can tighten it with a little